The girl who counted. The hallways of Grant High smelled faintly of old textbooks and lemon-scented floor cleaner, a sharp contrast to the polished, gleaming corridors of Bellevue Academy where Nova Taylor used to walk. The chipped lockers and scuffed linoleum under her sneakers told a story she already knew too well. This was a place people ended up, not where they chose to be. But life hadn't given her a choice. At 16, Nova had already learned how to keep her head down and her mouth shut. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to leave behind Bellevue, where she had finally figured out how to navigate the social tightrope. But after her mom was transferred to a different hospital across the city, another rung in her relentless climb to provide for them, Nova had no say. Grant High was closer. More diverse, her mother had said hopefully. As if that would make it easier. It didn't. From the moment Nova stepped into her first period, she could feel it. The invisible line drawn between the groups who already belonged and the ones who didn't. The way seats were unofficially claimed before she even crossed the threshold. At lunch, nobody invited her to sit with them. Nobody looked her way. She wasn't new to being overlooked, but here, she was something worse. She was an outsider. By the time the final bell rang and students flooded the hallways with laughter and lazy conversations about weekend plans, Nova felt a different kind of exhaustion. For most kids, the day was over. For Nova, it was only half done. She slipped through the throng unnoticed, heading for the exit. Blending in was something she perfected. Teachers who didn't notice you didn't expect anything from you. Students who didn't see you didn't ask questions you couldn't answer. It was safer that way. Outside, the air was thick with exhaust fumes from the idling buses and the clatter of kids climbing aboard. Nova tugged her backpack higher on her shoulder and turned left, away from the line of yellow buses, away from home. She had 20 minutes to get to her shift at Sonny's Diner. The walk was familiar. Past cracked sidewalks, corner stores with flickering neon lights, apartment buildings where laundry hung from rusted balconies. This part of town looked tired, like it had been left behind by time. Nova had felt that way, too, some days. At Sonny's, she tied on her apron as soon as she walked in. The warm hum of conversation, the clatter of plates, and the sizzle from the griddle were as comforting as they were exhausting. Mrs. Chandra barely glanced up from the cash register as Nova shoved her bag into a cubby. "You're late," she said. Nova checked the clock. 2 minutes. "Sorry." Mrs. Chandra shook her head, but there was no real heat behind it. "Don't let it happen again." The shift passed in a blur. Refilling coffee cups for customers who barely noticed her, wiping down sticky counters, balancing plates on her arms as she maneuvered through the narrow aisles. But even while her body worked on autopilot, her mind was somewhere else. Equations spun in her head like an endless loop, numbers rearranging themselves, formulas running through her thoughts like poetry. She reviewed each one, testing them, probing their weaknesses. Numbers made sense. They always had. When the dinner rush died down, Nova slipped into the small supply closet during her break. She pulled a worn notebook from her backpack and clicked on the flickering light overhead. These moments, between exhaustion and obligation, were the ones she claimed for herself. She flipped to a blank page and began scribbling, working through problems she'd found in old textbooks borrowed from Grant's underfunded library. This was how she kept up. No tutors. No online courses. No fancy prep books. Just 10 stolen minutes, a pencil with barely an eraser left, and determination. By the time her shift ended and she stepped back into the cool night, her body ached. But there was no satisfaction in it. She had more work to do. Nova made her way back across town, past neighborhoods where lawns were trimmed and lights glowed from front porches, past schools with gleaming signs and banners for their championship teams. She stopped at the Grant High Library, what was left of it. It was small, underfunded, with peeling paint and broken chairs, but it was quiet. That's what mattered. She ran her fingers along the shelves until she found a calculus book buried between outdated encyclopedias. It was dense, with pages annotated by someone who had probably graduated years ago. She smiled faintly and flipped through it. Even here, she found herself disappearing into the numbers. It was easier than dealing with people. At least, until someone cut through the silence. Seriously. Nova's shoulders tensed. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Monica Reed. Perfect hair, perfect teeth, and a perfectly cruel streak. 2 of her friends flanked her, both of them looking like they'd walked out of a catalog. They exchanged glances, smirking like Nova was some kind of joke. "I didn't know you were into this kind of stuff," Monica said, crossing her arms and leaning against the shelf. "Sure you're in the right section?" "Pretty sure the basic math books are over there." Nova kept her gaze on the page in front of her. "I'm in the right section." Monica's laugh was sharp and dismissive. You think you're smart now? Just because Mr. Dawson let you scribble on the board once. Nova didn't flinch, but the words dug in deeper than she wanted to admit. She'd spent so long being overlooked that this sudden, sneering attention felt foreign. Monica leaned closer. It's kind of funny. The girl who works at Sunny's thinking she's gonna be a genius. Nova closed the book and tucked it under her arm. She met Monica's gaze for the first time, calm and steady. Funny, she said softly. We'll see who's laughing when I'm gone. And you're still here. Monica's smirk faltered. Nova didn't wait for a response. She walked away, leaving the laughter behind her, fists clenched in her hoodie pockets. They didn't know. They would never know the hours she spent at the diner, sneaking glances at her notes between refills. They would never know the late nights when she studied by the dim glow of the street lamp outside her window. And they would never know how much harder she was willing to work. The test that changed everything. The next morning, Nova was still tired, but something was different. She didn't know that this day would change everything. Mr. Dawson was droning on about quadratic equations. Nova had already finished the worksheet 5 minutes ago, but she kept her pencil moving to avoid drawing attention. She learned not to stand out. But someone noticed. Dr. Adrian Keller stood at the back of the room, arms folded, sharp gaze moving across the rows of students. He was an educational consultant, at least that's what Dawson had said, but Nova had seen enough to know he wasn't just visiting. He was looking for something, and his gaze landed on her. Nova, Mr. Dawson's voice snapped through the room. Since you're clearly bored, why don't you come solve this? She froze for half a second. Then she stood slowly. The class shifted, the amusement obvious. She was used to that. She walked to the board, aware of every eye following her. The equation was complicated. Not impossible, but messy enough that Dawson expected her to flounder. He wanted her to fail. She didn't. Nova picked up the chalk and started writing. Each number, each symbol was precise. She worked steadily, blocking out the whispers and the snickers. She'd done harder problems, in worse conditions. By the time she finished, the room was silent. She stepped back. That should be right. Dawson didn't answer at first. His eyes moved over her work, searching for a mistake. There wasn't one. A murmur spread through the class. Then a voice. She's right. It was Dr. Keller. He stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Nova. That was advanced, he said, not something for high school. Dawson frowned. She's just guessing. There's no guesswork in math, Nova said, her voice sharper than she intended. It's either right or it isn't. Keller smiled faintly. Exactly. After class, he handed her a card. The National Math Scholars Program. She'd heard of it, barely. Full scholarships. Top universities. Take the placement test, he said. 1 week. Nova stared at the card. 1 week. 1 chance. 7 days to prove them wrong. The week passed in a blur of numbers, exhaustion, and relentless focus. Nova barely slept. School by day. Sunny's by night. She studied in the supply closet, on napkins, on the back of receipts. Her mom worried, but Nova couldn't stop. Not now. The morning of the test came too fast. The auditorium was packed. Teachers, students, even the principal. Dawson stood off to the side, his arms crossed, that smug look still there. This equation has stumped mathematicians, he said. But maybe Nova Taylor can solve it. She tuned him out. The equation was complex. Layers of variables, exponents, coefficients tangled in a web. Nova picked up the marker. She started writing. The room was silent. Students leaned forward. Jason, the boy from geometry, stared. The principal watched. And Dawson? Dawson's smirk faded. She solved it. When she turned, the room was dead quiet. Absolutely correct, Dr. Keller said. Shock rippled through the crowd. Jason whispered, she did it. Nova's heart pounded. Dawson looked like he wanted to vanish. No luck in math, she said quietly. Keller smiled. We'll talk after. The future she built. The offer came 2 weeks later. A scholarship. Accelerated programs. Mentors from MIT and Stanford. Nova left Grant High for good. 1 year later, she sat in a glass-walled study hall at MIT. Equations scrolled across her screen. And this time, she wasn't behind. She belonged. Jason sat across from her, grinning. Still making me look slow. She smiled. You do that to yourself. And maybe she was still the girl from Grant High. But now, she was also something more. She was the girl who counted.